Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Revamped Founder. In this episode, we have Charles Oppenheimer joining us. Charles is an investor, entrepreneur, and currently building Oppenheimer project, which is a project he has created in order to support the vision of his grandfather, J. Robert Oppenheimer, popularly known as the father of the atomic bomb. In this episode, we talk about what his grandfather was like, how the atomic bomb came into existence, what did J. Robert Oppenheimer think about during the Manhattan Project. In addition to this, we talked about something practical, like how to spot innovative founders, how can we create something innovative, how do cash flows work, how does he invest in innovative companies, and so much more. This is an incredible episode. Do listen to it to the very end. Thanks. Hey Charles, how are you? I hope you're doing well.
Good. Yes, I'm doing great. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And yeah, I mean,
I was very impressed by your offer. You said I'm 14. I do this great podcast. I couldn't say no to that, to the younger generation. That's really compelling to see somebody take such an initiative at that age.
yeah, this part, but this will be better than the one you did with Times, I guess.
Time was just a mere article, so
Yeah.
it's written one. Yeah. But I've been doing a lot of podcasts. The long form version of discussion I think works well for my method of communication. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think let's start. I'll just ask you, who is Charles Oppenheimer? I mean, the surname carries a lot of weight upon itself, but who are you in itself, and what connection do you have to J. Robert Oppenheimer and all those things? A little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I always say I'm Charles Oppenheimer. I'm no Robert Oppenheimer. I'm Charles Oppenheimer, right? It's great being part of the Oppenheimer family. Most of my life, that wasn't the defining feature. I was always taught to, make your own way in the world. I really became much more involved in the software industry, investing, entrepreneurship. But I've always had this kind of intuition that my grandfathers had such important thoughts and values that they really should be shared with the world. And was it possible that kind of representing him, talking about what he cared about could make a difference? So it's always been something I wanted to do. And it just so happens that this time in the world, so many people are so interested in Oppenheimer that I'm taking advantage to speak about what my grandfather thought, but probably more importantly, what does it mean today? How does that translate to what we should do today? It's been a big goal of mine.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one question which I'll ask, I don't know if it is a bit controversial. I'll just ask it. Are you proud of your grandfather?
Yes. Yeah, unambiguously proud of him because I think he was a great scientist, a great man, really. His values were really important. His education was amazing. The breadth of understanding of literature, poetry, physics, all of those things were really important. That means when he had a central place in history, he had to lead a wartime project. He was able to rise up to that, and then also see the depth of what he should do next, what people should do next, and share that knowledge with the world to the extent he could. Even if he didn't ultimately achieve everything he wanted, he would have wanted to have no arms race, but that doesn't diminish my pride in representing him. Maybe that question's always tempered with, he made a terrible weapon. He helped direct the laboratory that made a weapon that killed a lot of people, right? So should one feel not proud of that? It is terrible. War is terrible, and duty and death and war is a terrible thing, but he dealt with that the same way, millions of his compatriots in the war dealt with it. And I don't think it's our place to look back in our comfort of surviving a war that they helped fight and say, hey, those guys should have done something different. I don't think that's an appropriate view.
Interesting. I think one thing which I think came to my mind, I'll ask you is, he was a brilliant scientist. He comprehended things in ways in which we can't even imagine things. But why do you think when leading this project, which ended up being disastrous in some way, I mean, in every way actually. Did he not imagine that something like that could happen?
Um, if you look into it, it wasn't that they didn't know they would make a weapon out of it during war. They intended to make a weapon, right? And um, the real question is, whether this effort would then become an arms race where it then builds up to thousands of weapons and nations pointing these weapons at each other that to this day all makes us risk existential risk. Um, and the question is, did they think about it or no? These scientists had such foresight. If you look at what they wrote down in early 1944 and 1945, they saw that the main question already, even though the weapons hadn't been finished, is how do we manage it and deal with it after the war? Are we going to go into an arms race? So while they knew that was a big risk, I think Niels Bohr in particular influenced people like my grandfather, and there was actually other scientists who were even more on the activist side. They believed that, you couldn't just stop it, whether they saw an arms race going to happen or not. There was no way to stop it at all. Matter of fact, they thought it was more practical that even in the use of the weapons and then a more rational policy, it's still, they still believe they could influence things so that we would not go into an arms race, even in the midst of creating one. And so I think that was the perspective, is that there was still hope back then during the war and during the duty that you could make these weapons, that the significance did mean that we could all die from them. And therefore, the only logical conclusion was not to go into an arms race. For them, it was just quite clear. And that was the thing that I think was really misunderstood by the politicians. They didn't believe, the scientists said, hey, any other country can create this. It's physics. Somebody else is going to figure it out. And the politicians just said, no, we'll keep it secret and we'll keep all the weapons and we're the good guys. So that's how we'll solve it. And that maybe wasn't as forecast by people like Oppenheimer and Bohr.
So, in one way or the other, it was inevitable. So, do you think that it could have been stopped in any way?
I guess with historical analysis, we know that the Nazis were not really close enough to have had a weapon during the war, but the scientists believed that they were, because Heisenberg was one of the really top physicists in the world. And they said, hey, if we know how to make a bomb, he certainly does. And they just couldn't. There was such a risk. I mean, I think that's the hard thing to understand. Today, I don't know what India is like exactly. It was probably close to divided society, but in World War II in America, it was unanimous that there was a bad guy, and the Nazis were really bad enemy, who were killing a lot of their relatives, and they really just felt like they had to do anything to stop that. I don't think the science and the reality of nature is there. Like the fission's there, it's part of nature. It's always a question of what are you going to do out of it? Are you going to make bombs out of this? During World War II, those type of events, I think that it would have gotten to the point where a country made a bomb out of it. No way to stop that, period. And so it happens to be that America was the first one during the context of World War II. If it hadn't happened then, it would have been a country making a bomb out of it, most likely America. But, that portion was going to happen, in my opinion.
I think, yeah, that's he was a brilliant man, nonetheless. I mean, I don't think that there were a lot of people born like him, and I think what he was envisioning was different from how the politicians saw it and how the president at that time saw it. And
yeah, I mean, in my a lot of some of the scientists were much more clear. They didn't feel a duty to pay attention to politics. For example, there's a group of them who led a peace movement from within the Manhattan Project, and they said, "Hey, let's just not use the bombs," right? And that seems reasonable if you're an activist and a scientist, you're working on them, and they just unambiguously. And you can look back today and say those were the good guys because they knew what to do. My grandfather was an administrator in a war project, and he felt a duty to produce a bomb, and so you can say that's morally questionable. I don't think it was in World War II. Grandmas were using bombs. Nobody talked to their grandfather, who was a soldier who shot somebody in a war, and said, you shouldn't have done that. That's absurd. They were doing what they had to do at the time. So my grandfather being willing to be a leader in a wartime project and try to use that influence to influence the government from the inside was a harder thing to do than just saying from the outside or as a protester, we shouldn't have any bombs. He was trying to do it from the inside, where you can have more influence, but you have to participate with the inside of the political process. So he tried as hard as he could, and that was part of the movie. Of course, eventually his enemies took his power away and attacked him because they didn't like his advice. Which the government of the United States, shockingly, has apologized for recently when they rescinded the decision in 2022. They reversed that security hearing findings, which is a pretty great outcome that we didn't expect.
But is it of any use now?
Well, so the family perspective was always like, well, who cares? Why worry about it? But I will say that there was a message sent to scientists in America in 1954, and it said, hey, as a scientist, you can make bombs for us, but don't have a political opinion. Don't try to influence things. So having the government come back, even though it doesn't help Robert Oppenheimer itself, it really does help the scientific community, and perhaps kind of a new feeling of, government of the United States participating in our biggest problems in the world, one of which is climate change and increasing nuclear energy, telling scientists, we understand that we should not treat scientists this way. We're sorry, even if it happened 60 years ago. So I think that's the use of it, less for Robert Oppenheimer, more for the scientific community.
Yeah, that's an incredible point. I think I'll drift here a little bit. I think I'll ask something related to the Manhattan Project. So you're an investor. You invest in companies. You deal with cash flows. We'll talk about that later on. But would you have, if you would have gotten the opportunity, would you have invested in your grandfather's project?
That's a good question. I saw that as a preparation. So, like most investments, there's two sides of it. Like you will find a typical Silicon Valley attitude is like the most unusual thing that, everybody's pitching the same idea over and over and over, 50 versions of them. And the investors are often happier who took something that was like totally unexpected and out of the left field. It sounded like it wouldn't work. And most of the big companies end up being like that. If you look back, you just say, how did that company work? So there was an element of Robert Oppenheimer like that. When Groves picked him famously, he seemed like a very unusual choice. He wasn't Ernest Lawrence had run huge labs. He wasn't an administrator. But that's where I think the other part of it really comes through, especially with my investing experience and other people's. It's the most cliche thing to say that the people are what you invest in. And I've really found that being the truth in my investing careers. The ones that have worked off were a gut feel about the person, because we judge other people through other things than just rational spreadsheets and business plans. We get to know them and say, I think this person has the fire burning in them that's going to make an incredible project. And that is how Groves made his decision. It wasn't just on the rational matrix of things. He judged Oppenheimer as a person and said, I want to back this guy. He's the guy who should lead this part of it. And that, I'm not saying I'm General Groves level of insight, but I think that when you run into somebody who portrays themselves that way, they do become backable. And I'd hope that I would have made the same decision Groves made when he was picking out the leader.
What do you think that Groves, and just for clear, Groves is the person who represented the military who picked your father or grandfather, I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. He was the military leader, and he was the one who was in charge of, he was really in charge technically of the project, him and other military government leaders, but he had to choose the scientific leader, and he really made that in opposition to other people's ideas. So that he was Matt Damon's character in the movie of the leader.
So it, like you said, you would have invested in your grandfather, not in the but would you have invested in the project itself?
Yeah. I mean, of course, bombs. A simple thing is like I don't love defense technology or weapons related anything. I can understand how my grandfather did it in the context of a war, but I don't feel drawn to. I know people who love the idea of defense technologies because they're great businesses. I personally wouldn't invest in a military or an industrial, a defense war-based system. So that part's easy. I think it was very important for World War II. It's not something I would look for today. On the other hand, any technology you create or science you create, they were using fission. What do you want to do with fission? I think making energy out of it is an incredible use. Making bombs out of it isn't. So, if the outcome of that basic science was, energy use, I would be, it's one of my favorite areas of investment that I'm looking into now.
What your grandfather was doing, it was very innovative. Not like it was something that people would not have imagined of in the past. So, how do you think do people like your not your grandfather generally? He was, I mean, I don't call people geniuses, but he was a genius. But
Right.
how do normal people develop a sense of innovation and build things that have never been imagined?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the process of science is a series of unending failures, right? Like you're doing
Yeah.
science, something doesn't work, you try something else, it doesn't work. You're allowed to do that. So I think that's a good generalized rule for entrepreneurship. The other part of something for a normal person, like it wasn't an invention of Robert Oppenheimer to make an atomic bomb. A whole group of physicists and engineers and even government officials knew that that was possible. But the question is, do you execute it the right way? When something's really hard and a huge project with thousands of people, is that when you win? And that's
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's often where things go south. Yes, it's possible to make the world's biggest company now as young entrepreneurs in your audience, but do you really make it happen? And I think that is generalizable. It's not that, there was other physicists who were on the project who were just like even more technical geniuses than Robert Oppenheimer. They knew more math, they knew more physics, but they were only doing that one thing. You can be more broad-based with a difficult project, make that project work. And those are the type of things that bring success in the real world. And it's often not directly correlated to, just intelligence of one type.
Was Richard Feynman a part of the Manhattan Project? I think he was.
He was, known as the young whippersnapper. He's got this great reputation after the war because he's really a great person and everything. But at the time, he was just a junior scientist with, a genius, obviously, like the rest of them. But like he was just one of the guys, one of the youngest guys in the project with some great jokes and involved in the project.
Yeah, and the main reason why I asked that question, I think because your grandfather's maths, as he put it in the movie, and as I read on the internet, that it was not as good as other physicists. And Richard Feynman was relatively better at math, as he stated himself. So, this is something that we see in companies too. Like the CEOs are not good at technical things and not good at managing people or financials. How do you think should founders get people, like young founders get people who are better than them at different things and convince them to join at the same time? Because sometimes, yeah,
that's a good question because Robert Oppenheimer famously, like one of the things he was best at is recruiting people for the project, right? And so that can be as a founder, are you doing something that is compelling to other people? Other people will join you. That's your first indicator. I've had a lot of problems that in my business career, I'm kind of I can do it myself, do it on your own.
Yeah.
If you find yourself doing that without pulling other people in, you can't get as far. So some of the first signs of success is not only the energy you're bringing into your founding thing, but is it motivating other people from the very beginning and bringing them into the effort. And I've worked with some great tech CEOs in my life, and they're almost invariably like that. Like the act of bringing people together to a common cause is different than just one level of analytical intelligence, really.
And how do you assess yourself? How does the founder assess themselves that I can't be good at this? There's something which you can learn. You can learn financials, you can learn tech, but something is like you have to, I don't know. There's some things which you can't do. How do you assess yourself on that?
Well, I would say keep pushing until you fail, and then try it again. Everybody has different learning periods in their life, and one thing about technology is so geared towards younger people, and actually science is the same way. Like there's that what do they call it, fluid intelligence?
Yeah.
Where it's the most developed the younger you are. When you're dealing with software and technology, you want to push that as far as you possibly can, as young as you are, and you really have some huge advantages of understanding the changing world with your younger mind. You don't have to decide, is my judgment of my own character the type of thing that's going to make me successful, or more likely the type of things that you've gotten involved with and are expressing in the world. If those match what the world needs, it really takes over, and that becomes the whole thing. Are you doing something the world needs? You don't even have I think that's what usually ends up happening is like you can have desire, motivation, idea that you want to do something, but if you don't find that thing that the world needs at that time that you're able to provide, it doesn't make up for it. So I think the series of experimentation, trying, independent of success is really the right way to do it.
But how do you find something the world needs without the people actually knowing what they need?
Well, I mean, intellectual curiosity, like the younger you are, like what is driving you? You're setting up a podcast. This is an immensely successful thing, right? Why did you do that? Because you were interested in talking to people. You were interested in learning through discussions. And I guarantee you, there's 14-year-olds out there who say, oh, I could never do that. I wouldn't do a podcast, or I'll only do it if my teacher tells me. You were driven to do it on your own. And that's the type of thing that through, especially the younger you are, that you only if you're driven through your own interest level does it get you to the next place. And that's one of the most valuable type of learning that you can have, I think. And I just don't think that you need to decide a priori that you only will do it if you're going to become successful, right? Do whatever you're interested in. And then if that starts working, then it makes you successful, right? Why not pursue the type of things that you're interested in, you see room for in the world?
Yeah, but I think related to this, it's an incredible point. I think iteration is very important. I believe in building things. I think build things. If they fail, you try again. But if you build something that has the potential to like change the history, I mean, I'll not talk about the vision part here. It's a little bit different on the product side. So I'll say, take an example, like Google, maybe it changed how we work in our daily lives. But at the time when things like that are in the making, people don't know what it is. People don't know what will become of it. How do you develop that sense in the society itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like we are all working on many things. We want to be working on a Google, right? Like,
Yeah.
So anyway, it's great to try something and have it not work out. Okay, great, but that's not as great as creating a Google. So how do we find that? I don't know. If I knew that, I'd probably be starting Google. But I've tried many things like that, and for me, it. A lot of it comes from that driving interest. If there's stuff you can't stop thinking about and believe in, and just by the power law derivative, like not everybody can work on Google, right? Like that's just the laws of what is possible to create. It's going to be a very teeny percentage of things that you work on that are going to be that important. And so as a young person or somebody who's trying to create something important, of course, you wouldn't want to stop and say, well, I'm not going to do anything unless I know it's like absolutely the most important in the world. You just have to give your shots. And if it matches the world in that way, I guess that's my only answer. But I've tried to do the same thing. I've tried to understand up front, is this going to be the most important thing? But I think ultimately we're mostly subject to our interests, our capabilities, and how well it matches to the world at that point.
You've worked with a lot of founders. You've worked with people who have been very innovative, people who have created good things. I mean, your portfolio is pretty good. I was taking a look at it. So what do you think differentiates people who are very innovative from people who are who create things just for the sake of creation? And before that, what is innovation from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I might not even say innovation is the key thing. So innovation in my mind could be a scientist or somebody who knows math so well that they find a new property. Like often that's independent of the things that get manifested into the world that are most important. I think the qualities I've seen of founders who really win is almost like just a bottom line practicality, right? Like you could people would constantly criticize Bill Gates about what terrible software Microsoft is, but who made it happen? Who made it on billions of computers, did all the business things and won in the marketplace? I find that is what makes it work in the real world. Like that ability to execute, which I frankly don't have enough of in myself. I have the big ideas. I get really caught up in IT. I love the thought of it, but the people I see who build things at a huge scale have much more of the practical application of making things work in the real world under all constraints than just the innovation side. And I think that's pretty consistent from the founders who end up leading companies instead of just trying a few.
Cool. I was the other day. I think I was reading Ashley Vance's Elon Musk biography. I think it was the old one. In that, interesting question. I think I have been thinking about it since a very long time. Do you think innovation is a limited resource? Is there a point after which no innovation can take place, or can the level or scale of the innovation decrease?
I would suspect not really. Now, like, you can see the scientific breakthroughs that were happening from like 1920 or even earlier, or maybe 1905 to 1940. That was an incredible time in science. It was this incredible flourishing of understanding classical physics, the theory of relativity, and then into quantum mechanics, and just redefining what we thought about the base of reality. And it doesn't appear like since then these breakthroughs seem as fundamental, right? Like there's been progression in physics, but it didn't really redefine things. So there's certain times where there's a huge flourishing of understanding, but I think the reality of existence is so actually deep that it won't be. There's no end of understanding like what's going on in the universe. We haven't even tapped into like even the basis of what consciousness is. It isn't even touched by science. Matter of fact, science is a derivative of consciousness. So science can't even explain something that it's inside of, right? So I think that there's no end of the interesting parts of the earth and the universe, really. I guess that's where I'd go with that. It's not a rare commodity. We're probably going to have all kinds of innovation and understandings forever, unless we blow ourselves up. That would suck. That would slow us down significantly.
Slow us down? Yeah, I'll take that. That was interesting. So consciousness, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson also, I think hearing him say this too, that people have not even started, we don't know even what is consciousness. Most people don't know what it is. So there are a lot of different things like these which we don't know or we haven't tapped into till now. How do you tap into stuff like that which you don't know exists, or if it does?
Well, if I knew that, I think explain, but I think it's the same answer. You got to go with interest. Like, did the scientists, one thing that I view about science is like, it's much like a religion to me, right? I didn't do the math behind gravitational fields, and I can't explain why scientists know that 10 to the 32nd seconds after the Big Bang that we have an understanding of what was happening, but I take their word for it, and sometimes I think, how did they come up with those first principle understanding with no context? And so I think that level of interest is always available to us, that like understanding things with the scope of humanity, you gather up everything that humanity knows before, and you already have that, and to some extent it's already accessible to you. And now the hard work comes, like what is really interesting about the universe. And I think the study of life itself and consciousness are some of the most interesting things that we're not even on the map of science being able to touch. I'm somewhat skeptical of science ever being able to get there, but things like philosophy and I think are going to grow in importance, because that's the only way to understand like kind of the deepest things in the world.
Philosophy of what sense?
Science derived as a branch of philosophy, right? You got a PhD as a doctorate in philosophy in science. Everything that we understand about world is relative in some way, and a science and innovation and technological angle is just kind of like a structured, artificial measurement of what's actually happening in the universe. So I think there's elements of philosophy that give you a much bigger picture without like the boxes of things, and I think that might be the most interesting area to explore, especially as a young person, I think, but it often appeals to us old people more when you understand enough through life that no matter what you earn and what you accomplish and what you do, that's just like surface level stuff. Then you get to the hard problems, like why are we here? Why are we doing this? And that's when you get to philosophy and religion. I think I look back on the religions of the world. There's a reason that they've been around for thousands of years, right? The Bhagavad Gita was talking about the duty of mankind and how you transcend suffering. That was really true 2,000 years ago, and it's still true. It's not just replaced by a new materialistic culture. It's like there needs to be a reconciliation between these traditional methods of us dealing with our human questions and where science and technology and wealth came from. Those don't actually solve the underlying human issues that we all have. A typical, Silicon Valley started this culture of abundance in general, but like I would say the biggest derivative of it or disseminator of it was Google in Silicon Valley. And Google was a company that was so successful and so wealthy that you could kind of do anything. And like both within the company, and then when you left the company, you had a lot of money from this Google company, and then you could also fund other startups. And it's like, hey, take some money and do what you do, and there should be no limits. This could be great. That abundance culture, I think, is really powerful. I basically didn't grow up with that mindset in the Oppenheimer family. It's not what my dad taught me. It's not what we had. But I found that it's very powerful to tap into that and assume that like you can do the most important things in the world. I don't have any money. That's not going to stop me. I'm going to do what I can to make the biggest difference. And then I will be in touch with people who do have the money, and I'll scoop it up. And I think it's better to think that way, especially if you're coming from a place that doesn't have the abundance, doesn't have the millions of dollars. Like just believe that it will happen and build that way. That's my favorite part of startup culture. It's always 100 times harder than it looks, right? Because you read about the 5 companies that raised $1 million. You assume everybody does that. And then you go try it and nobody will give you any money, right? So it's a very difficult learning curve. But I think the assumption that there will be the resources to cover the really important things and then do those important things, often that bears out if what you're doing is actually like important and significant.
I think, all right, I know what happened there, but I think there's money in circulation in the society. Money is to fund companies, to fund funds. Then you have LPs, you have fund of funds, all kind of things. But the main question is, where does all this money come from?
That's easy. It's made up. It's literally made up, right? That was a great learning from like the Bitcoin economy or the crypto economy, and they say, hey, we're just going to make some money and circulate this, and then the economists or classic investment people say that's outrageous. You can't do that. And then of course, if you look at the economic system, it is purely a symbol and an agreement between institutions of just. Alan Watts calls it a measurement, right? Like it's not actual wealth. It's a measurement of wealth is what money is in a conventional agreement. Now it's a system that works extraordinarily well, right? Like we didn't have money 5,000 years ago or whatever the date was, or it was very not important with increasing. Now as the world's become more abstract, it means effectively real things. Now, if you have money, you can get a car, you can get an airplane, you can have these houses, but it's still just a symbol of like what real wealth is, and it always will be.
Yeah, that's my money. Do you think so? I think there's a good point to see what is capital flows. What do you invest in that you mentioned in your about page and all everywhere? Actually.
Sure. When I was in college, I was studying kind of international development and like how do you generalize. Like there's these places in the earth, like Western Europe and North America, that are like unbelievably wealthy or like the richest in the world. And you have other parts of the world that seem totally inequitable and they don't have enough resources. What can you do about that? The traditional model at that time, even when I was in college, they were saying this doesn't work. We've been trying to do these development projects in other countries where you go in effectively with charity and you give it to people without enough money, but it doesn't really create a system that really takes care of itself enough. And that's just kind of a known thing in the world. You try this a little bit of charity approach and it seems to be around the surface level. So I've had the opinion that, free market startup type mechanics are more powerful for that. If you can bring up a market system based into a developing economy and let people create their own solution for their own problems that can grow at tech company rates, it seems much more compelling to do that. My wife Karen's had a lot of experience with that in market and technology for developing countries, where it doesn't just use a nonprofit or charity model, it uses a market model. So I've invested along those lines, in developing countries. It has its challenges. It's like it's much easier to invest money there to get your money back. That's just the general rule of angel investing. Um, but I think that's one of the coolest things about the startup economy is that you can start a company these days in many parts of the world and then expect a Silicon Valley type growth and returns because there's been enormous tech companies started in India and grown at a massive rate. And same with Brazil and same with almost any country you can name, not every country, but like that dynamics of starting with almost nothing instead of this really structured hard thing, I think is really hopeful. And if that's true that you can invest in the next Google in India, then why not take a bet on a startup there? That's just the general premise.
Yeah, that's incredible. You took the example of India and Brazil, but the thing is with India and Brazil that these are growing economies as compared to, let's say, Russia, not Russia exactly, but in somewhat China or US, the US. But the ratio of companies being created at the scale of Google is relatively low in growing economies because it is growing. So how do you spot like companies in which even the power law of venture capital is you have to invest in ton of companies just to have a valuable exit?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the same in the US. That power law exists. I think the problem with the developing economies, most of them, is that they haven't had any of those exits, right? So if you knew that you were going to invest in 1,000 of them and you get returns, the problem with these developing economies is that many investors, like there's kind of like a structural and foundational thing. If it's not there, nobody respects the company. It can be taken away. The government can take it. If it makes money, the money's not worth anything. If it does well and it produces returns, you can't get your returns out of that country back to you. I think those are the things that need to be improved worldwide so that, America had a good base with that because Americans, until lately with certain presidents, were so kind of like rules based and like fairness based that we've created economic systems that say like, what's like fair and you can expect that those laws happen. And if they don't, you can go to court and you really expect this basis of being able to do business. And there's many places in the world where you can't expect that. Therefore, other investors can't go in there and you can't have. So I think that's still the risk is that for I'm not a risk adverse person, right? So I'm like, okay, I'll take some bet on some country and just try to make it happen and hope for the best. But that's not going to scale. That's like, a few percentage of people on this curve. You need to have the bell curve where it goes way up and everybody says, oh, of course I would invest in Nigeria because their rate of return is 10% instead of 2%, but it has to have enough like safeguards and expectations that if you join that and it works out, you get your thing back. And I think most of that's been improving in the startup economy where it really has been possible to take a bet on these international tech startups, but the majority of the economy and the foundations are not strong enough to have a broad base of investors coming in from other places in the world.
But this will only open doors for investors who are or angel investors who are investing with their own capital, with their own money. But in regards to VC funds or VC firms, it could be harder because they have to set up a different branch, maybe a vehicle, maybe for that country specifically, like we see with larger funds like Sequoia or A16Z, things like these.
Yeah, I mean, it's always harder for professionals because you need a business plan that sounds rational, right? And as we know, most of the returns are not from rational investors. Like if you were offered a Facebook or Google with no profit, no business plan, no revenue, no plan for revenue, those are the businesses that started like that. It doesn't sound like a rational thing. There was a few venture capitalists who took a bet on it. But if you look at 99.9% of the money available in the world, they would have looked at early Google and said, I can't invest in that. That's not even a business. You're not even doing anything important. So that's true with investing internationally. To be a professional venture capitalist, it's harder for them to make the justification to go into another market. There will be ones who lead that way and say, hey, I'm focused on India as a market, but with professionals, they can't change their mind. So if you're running a Sequoia fund and then somebody comes to you from India with a startup idea, they'd say, I love that. I don't invest in India. It's right here in my procedures. That's not my target. I can't do it. And so, that there will be more growth in international investing, and there will be firms who focus on it, but it's going to be slower than other parts until it's even more proven and everybody gets in. I think that's just part of the nature of it. But when economies get hard, and especially like times like this, the ones that survive are the ones that are doing the most real things. Like, you can talk about innovation and your ideas for the future, but the ones that do well are actually doing it. They're selling things in that economy. The growth rate is working and proving that the growth is there, and that's what pushes things forward, really. So I think that's the path forward for developing economies, is actual growth with real products, real customers, money actually turning over.
So is it are the real things supporting the potential Googles or the potential Facebook?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, one thing with tech, there's always the element that is the most important, and that's growth, right? Like, there's no other way to measure it. And the growth can only come from, some level of adoption or usage by the customer. So that growth could come from the attention that customers were putting into Facebook. That was very much real. And if you create a software application and nobody uses it, that's very different than millions and millions of people use it. So you take away the fact that they're not putting money into it, you're doing something that's real enough to grow by proving adoption. And that always is the thread line, independent of the exact business model.
That's such an interesting point. And I think I'll ask last two questions. One is related to this topic. Is do you think innovation in general will increase? We talk a lot about innovation in this topic. We do not talk about the realistic part of things. Do you think innovation will increase if capital flow becomes better among countries and if a network is created?
Yes, although I don't. The world's been on a trend of being ever more interconnected, and more economies are dealing with each other than ever before. And, our supply chains all around the world are absolutely connected. There's talk that there's a backslide right now. Like, after many, many, many years, now it's going to go back the other way. I would do what I can to prevent that and try to create more interconnections, more cooperation. And in that circumstance where there's more visible and structural connections between people in other countries and all over the world, I think it's better for everybody. More innovation, more safety, less war, better economies. It's better for everybody to recognize the fact that we're all interconnected.
For sure. And I think we take a hard stop here. We are getting closer to time. So, what would you advise a new age founder who wants to build something, wants to innovate in general? What would you advise?
Follow your interest in intellectual interest, even if it doesn't interest other people. So that, to me, that's very clear. What do you find fascinating, worth pursuing on its own interest for its own merits? That will be much more likely a path to success than kind of stepping back and saying, here's what I think are the most interesting areas for strategic reasons. So I think that's good advice in life, and especially if you're young, because you have time to really explore those interesting things and see if there's room there.
Awesome. Yeah, that is incredible advice. And I believe in that too. I mean, you have a lot of bandwidth to do a lot of things when you don't have a lot of responsibility in yourself, and I think that should be taken good care of, apart from just sending kids to school and do things which are wasting the time.
Agree. Nobody should go to school, in closing.
Yeah.
We're going to get banned in India for this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Cool. This has been incredible. And yes, I think that's it from my side. Anything you'd like to say to it?
No, it was great talking. That's it. I've said enough. Yeah. It was great talking, and I'm definitely impressed with the younger generation getting in here and producing content. So thanks for reaching out. I'm glad I could discuss.
For sure. That's my pleasure.